Tyranny is Tyranny. Howard Zinn. Around 1776, some important people in the British colonies of North America made a discovery. They found that by creating a nation and a symbol called the United States, they could take over land, wealth, and political power from other people who had been ruling colonies for Great Britain. When we look at the American Revolution this way, it was a great work of genius. The founding fathers created a new system of national control that has worked very well for more than 200 years. Control was desperately needed. The colonies boiled with discontent. By 1760, there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing the government of one or more colonies. There were also 6 black rebellions from South Carolina to New York and 40 other riots. But by the 1760s, the colonies also had people we call local elites. These were political and social leaders in their city, town, or colony. Most of them were educated people, such as lawyers, doctors, and writers. Their thoughts carried weight. Some of these elite colonists were close to the ruling circles, made up of governors, tax collectors, and other officials who represented Great Britain. Other elite colonists were outside the ruling circles, but their fellow colonists looked up to them anyway. These local elites were disturbed by the rising disorder. They feared that if the social order of the colonies were overturned, their own property and importance could be harmed. Then the elites saw a way to protect themselves and their positions. They could turn the rebellious energy of the colonists against Britain and its officials. This discovery was not a plan or a simple decision. Instead, it took shape over a few years as the elites faced one crisis after another. Anger and violence. In 1763, the British defeated France in the Seven Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies. France no longer threatened Britain's colonies in North America. But after the war, the British government tightened its control over these colonies because they were valuable. Britain needed taxes from the colonists to help pay for war. Also, trade with the colonies brought large profits to Great Britain every year. But unemployment and poverty were rising in the colonies. Poor people wandered the streets, begging. At the same time, the richest colonists controlled fortunes worth millions in today's dollars. There were many very poor people, but only a few very rich people. Hardship made some colonists restless, even rebellious. In the countryside, where most people lived, poor and rich came into conflicts. From the 1740s to the 1760s, tenants rioted and rebelled against landlords in New York and New Jersey. White farmers in North Carolina formed a regulator movement in 1766. The regulators called themselves poor peasants and laborers. They claimed to stand for the common people against the rich, powerful officials who governed unfairly. The regulators were angry about high taxes. They also resented lawyers and merchants taking poor people to court over debts. When regulators organized to keep taxes from being collected, the governor used military force against them. In May 1771, an army with cannon defeated several thousand regulators. 6 regulars were hanged. In Boston, the lower classes started using town meetings to air their complaints. One governor of Massachusetts wrote that Boston's poor people and common folk came regularly to the meetings. There were so many of them that they outvoted the gentlemen and other Bostonians close to the ruling circle. Something important was happening in Boston. It started with men like James Otis and Samuel Adams. They belonged to the local elite, but they were not part of the ruling group that was tied to Britain. Otis, Adams, and other local leaders recognized the feelings of the poorer Bostonians. Through powerful speeches and written articles, they stirred up those angry feelings and called the lower classes into action. The Boston mob showed what it could do after the British government passed the Stamp Act of 1765. This law taxed the colonists to pay for the 7 Years' War. The colonists had already suffered during the war, and now they wanted to pay for it. Crowds destroyed the homes of rich merchants and of Thomas Hutchinson, one of those who ruled in the name of Britain. They smashed Hutchinson's house with axes, drank his wine, and carried off his furniture and other belongings. Officials reported to Britain that the destruction of Hutchinson's property was part of a plan to attack other rich people. It was to be a war of plunder, of general leveling and taking away the distinction of rich and poor. But such outbursts worried local leaders like James Otis. They wanted the class hatred of the poor to be turned only against the rich who served the British, not against themselves. A group of Boston merchants, shipowners, and local craftsmen formed a political group called the Loyal Nine. They set up a march to protest the Stamp Act. The Loyal Nine belonged to the upper and middle classes, but they encouraged lower class people such as shipworkers, apprentices, and craftsmen to join the protest, but they did not include blacks. 2 or 3 thousand people demonstrated outside a local official's home, but after the gentleman who planned and organized the protest left, the crowd went further and destroyed some of the official's property. Later, the leaders said that the violence was wrong. They turned against the crowd and cut all ties with the rioters. The next time the British government tried to tax the colonies, the colonial elites called for more demonstrations. But this time, leaders like Samuel Adams and James Otis insisted no mobs, no confusions, no um, tumults. Tumult was a riot. They wanted the people to show their anger against the British, but they also wanted persons and properties to remain safe.